The Seahawks had a prime opportunity to bolster their playoff chances against the Steelers on Sunday. Unfortunately, they botched that situation with a boatload of missed tackles and an embarrassing defensive performance. We're going to be breaking down what that means for Seattle's slim playoff hopes going into the season finale on a jam-packed Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be rejoined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Happy New Year to each and every one of you, and thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are going to be diving into what went wrong yesterday in the Seahawks' 30-23 loss to the Steelers. Going to have some fun takes during our Monday Musings segment. We'll be answering your questions as well and talking playoffs. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. After beating the Titans last weekend, the Seahawks had everything they needed to control their own destiny. Just win the last two games, and you are in the postseason as either the 6th or the 7th seed. Unfortunately, the Steelers had other plans yesterday. The Steel Curtain smashing the Seahawks, rushing for over 200 yards, eating up 37-plus minutes time of possession, keeping Geno Smith and the offense off the field. They still were able to put up 23 points, but it was a lackluster defensive effort. And with that, as Pete Carroll mentioned after the game, they truly missed a prime opportunity that could cost them the chance to play in the playoffs for a second straight season.
I just got to stay right to it. If you hear Geno in the locker room right there, it means that there ain't no time to be feeling sorry for yourself. And he couldn't be more right. We got to get going. We got to come back tomorrow and get the week started and go after it again. So just like when you have the big wins, you got to deal with that. When you have the losses, you got to deal with that. And so hopefully the discipline that we've established will allow us to come back and get ready. I mean, Arizona, didn't they win at Philly today or against Philly? Yeah, I mean, obviously they're capable of playing great football. So it ain't going to be easy. There's no easy games. It's all really hard, and it's a championship opportunity for us. We'll see what the other circumstances allow. We'll see. I don't know. We lost our control of it. We had control of it, and we gave that up today.
Yep, the Seahawks lost their control of the situation, just like they lost all the tackle attempts that they failed to make yesterday. Everything slipped through the Seahawks' grasp yesterday, and now they are on the outside looking in the playoff race with the Packers jumping up to the final wild card spot. And really, it makes things simple for this last weekend. It's identical to last year. The Seahawks are going to need a miracle at Lambeau Field, Rob, and they're going to need Justin Fields to be the one that orchestrates it this year.
Yeah, a year ago it was Jared Goff, the Detroit Lions. This year, as you mentioned, it's going to have to be Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears, who, that was one of the other big developments over the weekend, of course, was that the Chicago Bears are going to have the number 1 overall selection in the 2024 NFL draft, not because of where they are currently slotted, but because they made the big trade, the Carolina Panthers, a year ago. Carolina selected the quarterback Bryce Young, number 1 overall, and in doing so, they gave up their number 1 overall selection. But at the same time, you've got the Chicago Bears team here, Corbin, who they have a young, talented quarterback in Justin Fields. And a lot of people believe that the Chicago Bears are going to be considering a quarterback at number 1 overall. You have Caleb Williams, the Heisman Trophy winner from 2 years ago. You have Drake May from North Carolina, both of whom have already said that they are going to be entering the 2024 NFL draft. You have a quarterback in Justin Fields who is going to be playing with a great deal of incentive to play well in Lambeau Field. But the Seahawks first have to just beat the Arizona Cardinals, and that is no given the way that they just put up a future defensive performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers this past week with everything on the line. And then, of course, you have to hope that, again, the aforementioned Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears, who are playing for heart at this point, they don't really have many postseason aspirations in Lambeau Field for a Green Bay Packers team that just beat Minnesota convincingly and are playing good football right now. So it does feel like you are very much on the outside looking in, whereas the Seahawks had it. It was in their possession. It was in Lumen Field against a team that was, featuring a backup quarterback, and sometimes in his career, a third string quarterback, and the Seahawks were clearly the inferior football team. So it's a happy new year, as you said, to all of our listeners. It's a year that it's appropriate that it is New Year's, because it's a great time to kind of reflect back on some of the mistakes that the Seahawks have made on and off of the field in the 2023 season, and to kind of wonder about what is the future in 2024. Is this a team that's even worthy of playoff consideration? I think that it is. I think that there are some elements of this team that are playoff caliber, but I also think that they have got to figure things out very, very quickly. Otherwise, the 2023 season is going to be one that's going to be forgotten quickly.
Yeah, they've put themselves in a position, and they did this last year. They put themselves in a position where they have to have somebody else get them into the playoffs. And of course, they've got to win. As you mentioned, Arizona just beat the Eagles in Philadelphia and put up 35 points on them. This is not the team that the Seahawks faced in week 7 when Josh Dobbs was the quarterback. He's now in Minnesota. Kyler Murray's back healthy. They are going to have James Conner out there, and he ran all over the Eagles yesterday. And oh, by the way, he's a former Pittsburgh Steeler that runs much the same as Najee Harris, a very similar style runner, and the Seahawks couldn't stop Harris yesterday. So you're going on the road to the house of horrors that is State Farm Stadium, where there's been so many injuries and there's been so many tough games where the Seahawks have won a lot of them, but they really had to grind them out. So that is not a given that they are going to win that game. But it is simple in the sense that you win, the Bears go to Green Bay and beat the Packers, and then you're in the playoffs. But if the Packers win, it doesn't matter what you do, and you have put yourself in that position by not being able to beat the Pittsburgh Steelers at home, losing your home finale, putting up what – and, I try to be reserved when it comes to the words that I use to describe performances by a defense, but I don't even think atrocious, putrid, any of those fit what we saw yesterday from this defense. There's a word that I can't even fathom. It was like watching one team that was playing for the playoffs and another team playing in an August preseason game. That is what it felt like watching this defense. And when you have so much at stake, that's really hard to watch. That's really hard to stomach just as a football observer. Like, why are you not playing with more desire? Why does this game not seem to matter to you? That's what it looked like on defense for most of the Seahawks players on that side of the ball. They just showed up, put their uniform on, got their game check. That's really what it looked like. And so you've got to find that urgency. You've got to find that that desire this next week. Because I'll tell you what, if they play like they did yesterday against that Cardinals team, they will lose by 25 points in Arizona. I'm calling it right now. The way the Cardinals are playing, they're not going to the playoffs, but they are excited about the future there. They got high draft picks. They've got some good young players. They're buying into Jonathan Gannon right now. They're going to be looking to get another big win to end the season and have momentum going into next year. And they're at home. You can't have a letdown where you're missing tackles left and right the way that we've seen this football team do in too many games this year, especially yesterday, and expect to go to Arizona and get the win. And then you're going to need help if you can find a way to get that victory. And I guess one of the good things, they're both playing at the same time. So players aren't going to be actively scoreboard watching, or they shouldn't be. Get your business done while the other game is going on. And then you don't have to, afterwards, you'll know, are we in the playoffs or are we not? But right now, the way they played yesterday, it's hard to view this team as a playoff team. They have got to quickly right the ship and put this one behind them and play much better next week. Coming up next, we're going to tackle your questions on our Monday mailbag segment. We got tons of questions on X and Threads. We're going to get to those coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, and you don't have to worry about battling against thousands of other players, including pros and sharks. It's just you and against the numbers, more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can submit all my picks in less than 60 seconds. And now that it's basketball season, this is my favorite part about Prize Picks. They've got a specials league where you can combine football and basketball. For example, you can have Steph Curry and DK Metcalf at 11.5 3-pointers plus receptions. And the other awesome thing about Prize Picks, unlike any other fantasy platform out there, they offer a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and doesn't come back for the second half, your player is rebooted. Prize Picks is an absolute blast each week. It's an easy way to enjoy daily fantasy without the hassle and land quick winnings. Go to NFL right now and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Happy New Year to you and your loved ones. Thanks for tuning in to this Monday episode. Unfortunately, Rob, it is a misery Monday Musings edition, a very miserable one after what we saw yesterday at Lumen Field. Not to take anything away from the Pittsburgh Steelers, because they came in and they exerted their will on the Seattle Seahawks. So you got to give them a ton of credit. Mike Tomlin had his team ready to play. They came out fast. They were running the ball hard. They came out physical. They were playing aggressive defense, even though the Seahawks were able to get some big plays on them. They were the team that looked like they were competing for a playoff spot. The Seahawks, unfortunately, looked like they were walking through the motions the entire game, at least on the defensive side of the football. With that in mind, coming up this 30-23 defeat that has put the playoffs on the brink for the Seahawks, what's the first thing that jumps out to you revisiting this game from yesterday?
Well, I just think that the Seahawks tackling was abysmal. I think that as you just referenced, the Pittsburgh Steelers basically just were the varsity. The Seahawks were the JV or C team or freshman team or elementary school team, whatever reference that you want to give here. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers just exerted their will on Seattle. I mean, it was, again, you're talking about a backup quarterback. Give Mason Rudolph a great deal of credit. He threw some dimes in this football game, but it's also because he had a great deal of pass protection. The Seahawks only had 1 sack. They had 2 more quarterback hits. All 3 of those were from Leonard Williams. Everybody else from a pass rushing perspective was basically invisible. And speaking of invisible, so were the Seahawks as tacklers. 15 tackles that were missed, according to Pro Football Focus. And you don't even really have to focus in on an analytical website to just recognize anybody who watched that game. Either you were in person at the stadium or just watching on television could see just the fact that basically everybody, especially the Steelers running backs, were able to stiff arm their way or laterally make an adjustment and leave Seahawks defenders flat-footed. I saw a lack of effort, and I don't use that expression very often, but a lack of effort, frankly, from some of the Seahawks defenders. I mean, they, as you said, looked like they were basically just cashing in their game checks. They were not playing as if their postseason lives depended on it, whereas the Pittsburgh Steelers did. Najee Harris was absolutely spectacular. He is not a back that has a great deal of speed, but you don't need speed if you are leaving defenders on the turf as you walk by them. And so Jalen Warren, of course, the other back, the quote unquote other back who was equally dynamic in this game that we talked about over and over again in the lead up to this contest. I mean, it just felt like this was such a easily winnable game. And it's in a lot of ways an easily analyzed game. The more physical team won, and they won convincingly. And so I think that if you were going to play this game over and over and over again, then the Seahawks would have lost over and over and over again. They were the smaller, weaker, slower, and less interested team And that is a recipe that is going to get a loss virtually every Sunday in the NFL season.
It's one thing to lose if you play a superior team and they just beat you down and you don't have the guys, you don't have the players to be able to do it. But you mentioned the effort thing, and I don't throw that around lightly either, because I know the amount of work that a lot of these guys put into their craft on this team. I've seen them on the practice field. I've seen what they do away from the practice field, lifting weights and stuff. I've seen some of these guys, the workouts they do in the offseason. I know the work that they put in, and yet we have to throw out the lack of effort here, and that is the worst way to fail in an NFL game, when you don't give effort and you seem disinterested. I think that's the perfect word to sum up yesterday. It was just embarrassing, and there's a couple plays that jump out to me. You know, Reek Woolen had a fantastic rookie season, and he's made some plays this year. But the second touchdown from Najee Harris, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, now that I've had a chance to go back and watch the All-22 and revisit that play, if I was a teammate, I would be furious with the lack of effort on that play. I mean, poor Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner's trying to bring him down to the ground. He's got 4 offensive linemen pushing the running back, and there's nobody else coming to help him out. Quandre Diggs gave a small little tap. Didn't really seem like he was trying to do anything, but at least he got his hand on there. I don't think Reek Woolen even touched the pile. He just stood there as a bystander. Good NFL defenses, not even great ones, good NFL defenses, guys swarm to the football so they can get players down. And how many times did we see that yesterday? So it isn't just the fact that they left so many tackles on the field. It's also there were plenty of business decisions made. You've got the playoffs on the line here. Why are you standing there just picking blades of turf off the field while your teammate is trying to get a running back to the ground with over 1,000 pounds of beef pushing him? Like, it's impressive to me that Bobby Wagner even got him to the ground, honestly. But the Steelers wanted this game. They had guys pushing that pile. The Seahawks didn't push back, and that was the way this entire game went. So you can look at a number of different things, but the effort on defense was just embarrassing. Everybody should be going into this next week wanting to prove themselves, because that's as bad as it gets in terms of effort. I don't know that I've ever seen a Pete Carroll defense in Seattle come close to that poor of an effort. It was abysmal. And that one play in particular stood out to me, but there were other examples where guys just weren't swarming to the football, huge creases for the running backs and making life easy for those guys. It's inexcusable. As for the next thing that I want to chat about coming out of this game, that there's positives to come from this, but this is a venting episode for me, Rob. We're going to get some venting out in this one, but you and I are going to discuss this. Geno Smith yesterday was absolutely masterful. I thought that he played like a top 5 quarterback for most of this football game. And I know that some of our listeners are going to say, but he didn't throw for 300 yards. He only had 1 passing touchdown. Going back and watching the film, I didn't realize how rough the pass protection was for Geno Smith in the first 3.5 quarters of this game. And yet his ability to navigate the pocket, slip away. There was one play that TJ Watt, the best pass rusher in the NFL, at least in terms of sacks, was on a straight beeline coming towards him, and he evaded him, steps up in the pocket, hits DK Metcalf for a 33-yard gain. There was another play where Isaiah Loudermilk got immediate penetration past right guard Anthony Bradford, and Geno Smith, as if there were eyes all over his helmet, he evades him, gets upfield, 21-yard catch for Noah Fant. He did this all throughout the game, and people are going to point to the fumble that he had late. He didn't hold on to the ball very long in that play. Charles Cross just got flat out whipped. And so that's really the takeaway for me is we can talk about Geno Smith all we want, but he is not the problem for this football team. If anything, I can't imagine what yesterday would have looked like without the way that he played, considering the circumstances. But really the takeaway for me, there are still more questions than answers with this offensive line. And I know the Steelers have some studs on that pass rush, but Geno Smith was under constant duress. The run plays that hit big primarily were because Ken Walker III made heroics happen with his athleticism, or DK Metcalf got a block on the outside. The line up front did not win the line of scrimmage consistently in this game. Pass protection is the issue. Then you've got injuries. I was hoping at the end of the season that you'd still have some optimism about the future, and maybe there should be, but this O-line still got major problems, and that's just the reality that was exposed again yesterday.
Well, it's the O-line and the defensive line. It's the line of scrimmage just in general, Corbin. I mean, the Seahawks' unwillingness to dedicate significant dollars in free agency, and obviously Draymond Jones was a huge free agent addition, but it certainly hasn't paid off. And obviously the lack of utilization of high draft picks in the interior of the offensive and defensive lines just has kind of put the Seahawks on the outside looking in. When they play big physical football teams, the Seahawks lose. I mean, that's really what's come down to. Just think about it. I mean, obviously they beat the Philadelphia Eagles, and I'm still stunned by that performance, but they got thumped by the Baltimore Ravens. They got beaten by the Cincinnati Bengals. They've been thumped twice by the San Francisco 49ers, the Dallas Cowboys. The Pittsburgh Steelers just ran roughshod over you again with a backup quarterback because you physically cannot hold up. And so I'll kind of come back to that Geno Smith conversation here just for a moment, because I have to 100% agree with you. I think that he was masterful with his ability to recognize the pressure, dip, duck, dive, kind of do whatever he had to do to be able to
that's his own Houlihan dodgeball here.
Exactly. I mean, but his ability to do that and anticipate where the open receivers were and be able to throw dimes at DK Metcalf, to Jackson Smith and Jigba. That was a beautiful touchdown throw. It was his only touchdown of this game, but he was 23 of 33 for 290 yards and barely had enough time to breathe in the pocket at home. So the fact that the Seahawks had the offensive line struggles that they did, and tip of the cap to Stone Forsythe. I thought that he played a pretty darn good football game. The rookie Oluwatimi getting pulled in and being forced to play. I thought that the Seahawks offensive line, I know that the analytical websites out there again were highly critical of the way that the Seahawks pass protected in this game. I thought that they protected good enough, and Geno Smith put on his Superman cape at times in this game just to keep the Seahawks even close, because again, on the defensive side of the ball, that to me is where we have to focus our attention here. On the defensive side of the ball, the Seahawks were truly offensive.
Yeah, and I think one last thing that I want to touch on real quick, and I have to go back and watch the All-22 again, especially on the defensive side of the football. But one thing that is becoming apparent on the defensive side of the ball in particular for this team, when you think big picture, it does seem like personnel and scheme on defense are colliding again. Yep. You have all these looks that you're running that are better suited for 4-3 defensive personnel, and yet you're playing 3-4 defensive personnel, and it's not working. And teams are whipping you in the run game, particularly off tackles. And then you're playing backup linebackers. Devin Bush was out of position on a number of plays. He made some nice tackles yesterday too, but he was certainly out of position a number of times, getting devoured on blocks. The personnel just isn't right for what they are trying to do. So you're wondering where that disconnect is between the front office and the coaching staff, trying to figure out how can we build a roster that fits what we're trying to do. And that is becoming more apparent. So I can't sit here and talk about all the specifics in terms of the type of fronts they've been playing, but they're not playing the same type of stuff they were early in the season. Losing woes, who certainly has hurt that. They just don't have enough horses at the edge position to be able to play some of the fronts that they are playing right now, and teams are just flat out abusing them because of that. The interior defensive line, you're not getting enough from Draymond Jones. I felt like Jaron Reed and Leonard Williams were mad yesterday. They were okay, but not great. These teams are taking advantage of the personnel issues that the Seahawks have, and that is certainly something that stood out to both of us in this game. And I think they got to do some soul searching whenever the offseason comes, whether they make the playoffs or not, because this is the second year in a row this has been going on. And year two with your defensive coordinator, you shouldn't be having these issues if you are bringing in the right personnel and having the right depth. As I mentioned earlier, we were going to do the mailbag second segment. We were so excited to jump into our Monday musings, we decided to switch it up. We're going to get to those mailbag questions now coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action, and the app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that can easily be found in the Parlay Hub, including spreads such as the Seahawks being an early favorite over the Cardinals on the road in Week 18. Player props, including DK Metcalf's receptions and receiving yard totals for this weekend, over-unders, and much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to get to that mailbag. Normally, we do it in the second segment, but there was so much to talk about coming out of yesterday's game that we had to get to that first. But without further ado, let's get to all of our questions from our valued listeners. And our first one here, Rob, this one is coming from S Portal Fantasy. What's the percentage likelihood Jamal Adams is back in a Hawks uniform? If his talent has been this enticing for Pete Carroll this long, then I would expect him to view this season as his knee isn't 100% and McVay and Shanny attacked him in coverage.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that unless the Seahawks are willing to absorb an awful large salary cap hit, and I think that number 33 is going to be back on the field next season for the Seahawks, whether you like that or not. The reality is, and I tried to express this in the pregame, our podcast before this loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers, that Jamal Adams brings a physicality that, frankly, very few of the other Seahawk defenders bring. And so, again, criticize Jamal Adams all you want. He would have helped against Pittsburgh. And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why Pete Carroll in particular, I think, clings to Jamal Adams, because he recognizes the leadership, he recognizes the passion, and he certainly recognizes the closing speed and physicality that a healthy Jamal Adams can provide. Now, is he going to be able to provide that? Is he ever going to justify the cost that the Seahawks gave up in terms of draft picks and in terms of salary? That is a whole different conversation. I think medical doctors, the biggest, if not the biggest, offseason question the Seahawks have to face entering next season.
Our next question here, coming from Big M Media: how is this tackling issue going to be solved? Well, I wish that I had an answer for you on this particular one. We have talked about this several times in the show because this is not a new phenomenon. The Seahawks entered this game ranked 5th in missed tackles, according to Pro Football Reference. And we know this has been a consistent issue for Seattle, really, for the last 3 or 4 years. We are so far removed from those teams in the Legion of Boom era where when they got their hands on guys, they got into the ground. I just feel like Pete Carroll, he keeps saying that they're doing stuff in the field. The players are saying we're drilling on stuff, but I've been at training camp the last several years. I've been at almost every single open practice, and I can't tell you, it might be less than 3 or 4 practices that I can remember the Seahawks have done anything that looked like it was a meaningful tackle drill. And I understand you're trying to protect players, but at least several years ago, they used to do things with track pads where they would bring out the pads and they would tackle on top of those to protect guys. It's been several years since I've seen them do that in training camp. So I don't know what the solution is, but whatever they are doing right now, trying to work with the rules and the non-contact out there, I don't know what they're doing right now, but it ain't working. They have got to revisit the drawing board and try to find a way to get these guys ready to play, because they're missing tackles in space. They aren't taking good pursuit angles. The swarming issue, that isn't even something necessarily that you drill. Like, guys just have, that's a mindset thing. You've got to be able to swarm to the football. But this has been a consistent issue for several years running that I don't know if there's a clear solution to it, but right now, whatever they're doing in practice, it's not translating to good production on the field. Next question here for Rob. Looking at the cap next year, the Hawks have very little room to add talent. What do you think they will do to make cap space? And this is coming from the Robert Boas on X.
Well, I think it's a very similar conversation to what we just had here with Jamal Adams. I think the Seahawks have very serious conversations internally that they have to have with themselves about some of the players on their roster that are due massive amounts of money, and are they actually translating to victories on the field? And I'll just mention a couple of the highest paid Seahawks for next season, at least, again, projected: Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, Tyler Lockett. You have some huge free agents like Damian Lewis, the left guard, the most experienced of your offensive linemen. So again, the Seahawks have some big decisions here to make. If you don't believe that Geno Smith is the quarterback, I think that he played brilliantly in these last couple of games, and I think that that he is not the problem to the Seahawks issues so far this season. But still, he is, of course, as the starting quarterback, is going to be doing an awful lot of money as well. The Seahawks, again, have a whole bunch of internal decisions they have to make. I'm confident that they can free up some money if they want to, but it is going to take the true reshuffle of this program if that's in fact what they want to do.
Our next question coming from Cody Knows via Threads: are the Seahawks better off with Geno on his current contract or Drew Lock at a much cheaper price as the starter next season? I do think that this is a worthwhile question to ask, because we do know that Geno Smith's cap hit is going to triple next year. That's the way that his contract was structured. You can make an argument, since his numbers across the board have dipped some this year, maybe he's not worth that cost. But I'm going to counter that, and I'm just going to look at these last 3 games for the Seahawks. Geno Smith has completed 65% of his passes for over 800 yards, 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception, and a 102.4 passer rating. And this has been while the defense has been letting opponents hold on to the football for 35 plus minutes every single game. And so the offense is getting limited possessions, and he's still putting those kind of numbers up. And we talked about the O-line situation. He has had 9 different offensive line combos in front of him this year with the injuries that they have had. And yet he has been able to still be productive. I think if the O-line would have been healthier this year, he's probably in the mid-20s for touchdown passes. But it's also been limited opportunities because of that defense we keep talking about that can't get off the field. I've had this argument with people. There's a lot of fans out there that believe Geno Smith is good enough to get to the playoffs, but he's not somebody you can compete for championships with. I even more steadfast right now believe that you can absolutely win a championship or compete for championships with Geno Smith, but you got to get the rest of the roster put in motion, particularly on defense. You have got to figure that out. If this defense wasn't in the mid-20s or lower in every key category, this team probably has 10 or 11 wins right now. And Geno Smith is not the problem, as you mentioned. So I'm hesitant. Drew Lock made those great plays against the Eagles, but I'm hesitant to say, well, let's just make him the starter next year with a rookie behind him because he played decent in 2 starts. His numbers still paled in comparison to what Geno Smith has had in his last 3 starts. I just think Geno is a far superior quarterback. Not that Drew Lock can't get the job done as a spot starter, but I think that Seahawk fans, that it's one of those be careful what you wish for type things, especially if you just want to chuck a rookie into the lineup. We've seen that not work out more times than it has worked out in the NFL. And our last question here, Rob, you and I are both going to get an opportunity to answer this one. I know this will excite you because we're talking about draft maybe a little bit here. What positions need to be addressed with the most attention in this year's upcoming draft? Guard, middle linebacker. What are your thoughts? This coming from Pacific Northwest Professor via X.
I definitely think that improved play at both of those positions is required. I don't necessarily believe that it's going to come in the draft. Just in my looking at the 2024 class is the way it stands here on January 1st. January 15th is the deadline. I have been paying an awful lot of attention to the inside linebackers that I believe are going to be eligible for this upcoming year's draft, and I don't see a lot of difference makers, and that is concerning to me from a Seahawk perspective. I think it's going to require a little bit of an overhaul and just your defensive philosophies. You're going to have to get bigger and stouter if you're going to try to be able to perform against offenses that are built around running the football, like, again, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Dallas Cowboys, the San Francisco 49ers. Some of the best teams in the NFL are all built around the run still rather than throwing the ball. The Seahawks are built on the outside in rather than from the inside out. And so that to me is kind of a confounding decision, the way that they have chosen to build this team. I do think that, again, if you are going to have the conversation about going a turnover at the quarterback position, I think you can make an argument that that's only one player, as opposed to trying to change the entire defense, which obviously is 11 players. And, obviously the Seahawks aren't looking to rebuild their entire defense. But the point is that I do understand the argument about going with the quarterback. If you can get a guy who is so much better than everybody else, that he might be able to put your roster in a whole different stratosphere, I understand that argument. You just better damn well be right. Because if you're going to gamble on a rookie quarterback, there's a bunch of NFL teams that are starting rookie quarterbacks this season. None of them are going to be in the playoffs. And obviously, walking into week 18, the Seahawks are still in the playoff conversation. So again, that's really what it comes down to me, is just deciding what you want to do with that spot and who you want to allocate your dollars to.
Yeah, I think linebacker is a position that's pretty thin in this year's class from my little bit of study that I've done so far. And unfortunately, that is a spot that is a major question mark for the Seahawks, because Jordan Brooks, Bobby Wagner, and Devin Bush are all free agents next season. And you've obviously got different question marks with all three of those players, whether or not you're going to be bringing them back for next season. But I would think interior offensive line as usual at the guard spots, depending on Abe Lucas's knee. I mean, we might be talking right tackle a little bit. I think that is a conversation that may be happening behind the scenes right now. I hope that that's not the case, but the offensive line still remains a question mark for this football team. And I think the safety position, depending on what happens with Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams, Julian Love, I didn't think played near as well yesterday, made quite a few mistakes. This is still a position to be nice to get a younger player that they can develop that can play on defense for him. And maybe Jarek Reed coming off an ACL can be that guy. But there's a lot of positions away from quarterback. Defensive line, you need more beef there, as you mentioned. There's a lot of spots that need filled. And again, that's why I've been making the argument. I still think Geno Smith can be a quarterback that can help you compete for championships, but you need to improve this roster around him to set things up, especially on defense with that O-line, so that you can maximize his skill set. And I think you could see this team be a competitive force in the NFC, but there's a lot of ifs there, and the draft is still several months away. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, it's Tell the Truth Tuesday. There may be some real interesting truths coming out of that game on Sunday and heading towards this season finale against the Arizona Cardinals. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your New Year's Day. Go Hawks.